Hi, my name is Rabbi Shoshana Cohen. I'm on the faculty of the Conservative Yeshiva in Jerusalem. And I'm excited to be here participating in this global day of Jewish learning brought to you by Limud. We're here today to talk a little bit about Kvod HaBriot, human dignity, Tzelem Elohim, being in the image of God. And I'm happy to share a little bit about what I think this value means in terms of what we would like the world to be, in terms of the work that we need to do, and putting it into some kind of context in the world that we are living in at this very moment. So, of course, one of the first things that we know about humans is that they are created in the image of God, and that their being in the image of God is a unifying principle. Of course, it says, "Vayivra Elohim et Adam b'tzalmo, b'tzelem Elohim bara oto, zachar u'nekeva bara otam." Right? God said, God created humans in His image, in the image of God. God created them, and they were created human, male and female. Now, this idea that humanity was created in the image of God is an idea that we say a lot, right? It's the very beginning of Bereshit. It's supposed to kind of inform everything about what we do in the world and what we want to see in the world. And I have to say, what it should do is make it so that we have equality and justice in the world. The idea seems to be, I am created in the image of God. You are created in the image of God. And so we need to make sure that everyone has that the godliness of everyone is allowed to come out and be expressed, and that we're responsible for the essence and the dignity of every other human being. I have to say that for whatever reason, and maybe we can unpack this a little, that's actually a really difficult goal to achieve, right? Despite the fact that this is such a clear value, that this is what the world is all about, human dignity, people being in the image of God, the equality that should come from that, the world that we look at is far from being a place where that actually is manifest, where people actually are equal, where people can see the humanity and the dignity and help others maintain their dignity. So I want to explore now is what might we do in order to be able to put this notion of Tzelem Elohim and Kvod HaBriot into practice? How do we ensure that on a daily basis we're actually doing this, that we're not just holding this as kind of a value that's a kind of introductory value for the Torah? How do we ensure that we're actually putting it into practice all the time? Now, I think the way that we might be able to think about this is by reading backwards. What do I mean? We read the Torah in one sense is linear, right? We begin in Bereshit and we end in Dvarim. But in our lived experience, of course, the Torah is actually cyclical, right? We've recently finished Dvarim. After having finished the book of Dvarim, we're now starting the book of Bereshit. So what I'd like to do, and often what we do is look at Bereshit and see what that's going to mean about the rest of the Torah. In this case, what I'd like to do is look back at Dvarim and see what we had there, and use that perhaps as a way of putting into practice the Tzelem Elohim that we're going to encounter when we get to the reading of Bereshit. So a kind of maybe backwards way of learning, reading from what we see in Dvarim and having that inform what it means for Bereshit and for Tzelem Elohim. So Sefer Dvarim is filled with a lot of different kinds of materials that are there to kind of make the Torah live on. One of them is that it has many, many, many mitzvot. It has one of the 3 biblical law collections, Deuteronomic law, what we call in academia, and a lot of those laws are actually found in Parshat Ki Tetzei. A large percentage of all the mitzvot we have in the Torah are actually in Parshat Ki Tetzei. And I wanted to take a few of them, look at some of the mitzvot that we have in Parshat Ki Tetzei to kind of think about what the attitude of Dvarim is towards mitzvot. And hopefully, ultimately, we'll wind back and see what that image, what those mitzvot may tell us about this idea of human dignity. So, for instance, what are some of the mitzvot that we have in Parshat Ki Tetzei? Okay, so we can look at a few of them. First of all, we have in Dvarim Chaf Bet in 22, the famous, a lot of these laws are very famous. Lo tireh et shor achicha עושה או נידחים והתעלמת מהם, השב תשיבם לאחיך. If you see your fellow's ox or sheep gone astray, don't ignore it. You have to take it back to your fellow. This is the law of returning lost objects. But what's the position? You shouldn't kind of be in a place where you see someone's cow or someone's ultimately ox or it gets expanded to any object that they have and ignore that. What you need to do is, and it says it in a very active way, Hashev tashivem la'achicha. You must surely return them to your fellow. What this verse, and we'll see how this repeats itself in several of the different mitzvot, but we can already see here that it's a likely, what's the likely scenario? That someone's kind of wandering around, right? In a public kind of space. There's not a lot of people around. They happen upon a cow. And when that happens, they're faced with a choice, right? They can either ignore the situation, or, says the Torah, you could ignore it, right? But don't ignore it. And in other places, this is echoed very strongly. You should not ignore it. You cannot ignore it. You must not ignore the situation. What you need to do is actively make a choice to return it to your fellow. And I would say, so that's the choice that we're presented with. I happen upon an animal. I could ignore it, but says the Torah, you may not ignore it. You need to actively return it. And I would say that a lot of the other mitzvot that we have throughout this parsha, and you're welcome to open it up and take a look, are scenarios in which you just kind of happen upon something, right? The same is very similar, I think, happens. Ki yikareh, it actually says in 22:6. Ki yikareh kan tzipor lefanecha. You are a bird's nest kind of just like happens upon you, right? We might say you happen upon it, but you're walking along and you happen to see a bird's nest. And here too, similar to the cow, you've now encountered something in the world that just happened. And it could have happened on any tree or on the ground or wherever it is, right? There's a description of that experience of in what situation would you actually come upon a bird's nest, and it had also what could be in the bird's nest. It could be eggs, it could be little chicks, and you see the mother bird is sitting on her chicks. It's describing the situation. You're looking at this scene. And here too, like you were faced with the cow, here too, you're faced with a choice. You, as the person who you are, wants to take the eggs, and then you're faced with the choice, and says the text, Shalech tishalach et ha'em, vet habanim tikach lach leman yitav lach ve'erachta yamim. So at that moment, says the verse, take a moment. And consciously, what you need to do is send away the mother bird, and then you can take the chicks. So what we're asked to do is, again, encounter this scene, pause, consider it, and then make a choice which the Torah seems to perceive as the correct moral choice. We have several other situations like this, right? If you happen to be doing something completely normal, like building your house, right? Says the Torah, ki tivneh bayit chadash, and it uses that ki, you keep hearing ki, when it happens, that you are building a new house, v'asita makeh, you need to also make a railing, around your roof, ve'lo tasim damim beveitecha ki yipol hanofel mimeno, because you don't want to incur any kind of guilt upon your house because someone might fall. So here too, you're doing something in the normal way of life. You happen to be building a house. You need to take a moment and stop and build a railing and make sure that people are safe. There are many, many examples of situations where the regular life happens. And the Torah tries to say what you need to do is take a moment, stop, think about what's going on, and then make the right moral choice that's going to often protect not only yourself, but mostly is going to be help with your awareness and the protection of other people. It also says, Ki tavo bekerem re'echa v'achalta anavim kenafshecha savata v'kelecha lo titen. Right? So you happen to be walking and you are hungry and you come across a vineyard. Well, you know what? It's okay if you take some of the grapes, but you can't fill up a vessel and take it home with you. Right? Again, when I'm walking, I'm doing something somewhat absent-mindedly, right? I'm recognizing that sometimes those things are going to happen. I'm going to be walking, we're taking some grapes. Stop, think for a moment, and make sure that you are actually choosing to act in a particular way, and make sure that your choice reflects an awareness that this belongs to someone else, that there are other people in the world. And so we start to see here is a reality in which this is what the mitzvot are about. This is what Dvarim is telling us. This is what Parshat Ki Tetzei is telling us. The world is going to happen to you. You are going to happen upon a variety of different normal circumstances. What we want you to do is dafka in those normal circumstances to stop and think and make moral choices. Every time, in many different kinds of situations, that's what we're going to ask you to do. That's what we're going to call upon you to do. And that's what halacha is about. Halacha is about stopping, dafka in situations where things seem to be, where you could be passive, and making a moral choice. Anytime when I happen, again, to go back to the lost object, when I happen upon that cow or whatever it is, I have the choice of ignoring it. I also have the choice of manipulating a situation like that for myself, right? I'm just, I just happened to see a cow. Well, is there a way for me to actually take that cow for myself? And the truth is that the Mishnah in Bava Metzia becomes very occupied with that question of how and when is it okay to take this happening, this coincidence, this thing that just happened to me, and actually use it to benefit myself. So I could ignore it. I could manipulate the situation so that it helps me. Right? And I could say even informs my own dignity. Right now, I'm a poor person and now I have a cow. That perhaps elevates me and my tzelem, right? The dignity that I have. But says the Torah, no, actually what you need to do is make a different choice. You need to look at that lost object and see who it belongs to and see the owner behind it. And see that person, and make sure that you return it to them. And this is what the rabbinic notion of a siman is. In order to return a lost object, it has to have a siman. That is, I have to look carefully and try to find the other person, an evidence of the other person within that siman. Now, the Tanaitic, the rabbis, the Tanaim, who wrote what the Mishnah and also Midrashei Halacha, that is, learned out certain halachot learned and expanded halachot from what we have in the verse of the Torah, took this notion of they read these laws, these happenstance laws, I might say, in a very specific way. If the Bible is written in what we call a casuistic way, that is, it tells me a story, right? We had the story of the nest, we have the story of the lost object, and then it tells me how to act. The Midrash often translates the story into more halachic parameters. Okay, that is one example. For instance, we can look at is from the issue of Shiluach HaKen. If we look in the book of in Sifrei Dvarim, which is a Midrash Halacha on Sefer Dvarim, it adds all of the words in the verse, even the words in the verse that are just kind of describing the situation, are interpreted as expanding the parameters of the halacha. So, for instance, I might think that this might only happen in Reshut HaRabim, in Reshut HaYachid. I see it's happening in my own property. How do I know that I also have to fulfill this mitzvah if it's happening in public? Well, says the Midrash, it says baderech, right? That word baderech in the Midrash, in the Pasuk was just, well, you happen to be walking on the road and this is where this would happen. No, the Midrash says, no, baderech actually tells me something halachic. It tells me that this mitzvah must be done in public spaces and not only in private spaces. It also says, well, you know what? I saw that it's happening along the way. How do I know that if I see it up in a tree, I also need to do this mitzvah of shiluach haken. So it says, Al ha'ilanot minayin. How do I know that if whatever it is on the tree, if the nest is on the tree? Talmud lomar b'chol etz. It said on any tree, if you also see it there. Now, these are very small examples, and we have many of them throughout the Midrashei Halacha. But the point is that we have an aesthetic details, a story that's told by the verses in Dvarim, and every little word and every detail is interpreted by the Midrash as having something to do with the halachic parameters of what needs to, of how this mitzvah needs to play out, right? Both, sometimes it goes into who it applies to and what situation it applies. Sometimes it adds things, it adds actual actions that we're supposed to do. And we see this happening throughout Sifrei Dvarim and also in the Mechilta and Shmot, taking what are just background stories for the laws and using those verses and those words to actually expand the obligation itself. So that's what we have. The Torah and the rabbis are telling us that the Torah is about making these halachic choices. Now, I think one of the most extreme examples or articulations of this attitude of what it means to what halacha is expressed by Rav Soloveitchik very famously in his book, Halachic Man, where he says, and this is a metaphor that Rav Soloveitchik uses many times throughout the book, but here's one example of a quote: when halachic man, now man, the gendered aspects of this, we can unpack at another time. When halachic man looks to the western horizon and sees the fading rays of the setting sun, he knows that this sunset or sunrise imposes upon him anew obligations and commandments. So says Rav Soloveitchik, as a person who is within this halachic system, when they see nature, in this case when you see the sun, there's no moment in which you're just existing and experiencing that sunrise or that sunset. Immediately, having seen it, you're saying, what this means is it's going to be time to daven Mariv soon, right? What this means is that in X, Y, and Z time, I'm going to now have to do Shacharit. That's what it means. You're looking at nature and the world from the perspective of halacha. Now, I will be honest, there were definitely times in my life where I felt that this notion of halacha, and certainly this image of Rav Soloveitchik, felt problematic to me, right? The idea, certainly spiritually, right? I want to just kind of experience the sunrise. And I'm not sure that I want to just be pushed immediately into translating that into what it means from a mitzvot or a halacha perspective. There's something that feels kind of difficult about that. In similar ways, sometimes those midrashei halacha, which add more and more halachot in what's clearly a kind of nice background story, also can feel a little bit tedious. And maybe doesn't leave enough room for that radical kind of wonderment and amazement that we sometimes feel when we look at the world. And at the same time, I'm feeling that now this perspective on halacha and on the nature of mitzvot is actually having renewed significance for me. Because the world that we're living in with COVID is one where it feels like a lot of happenstance, a lot of coincidences, right? We feel that there's a kind of wave that has come upon us and we have very little control over it. A lot of things which we thought we had control over, our freedom of movement, our ability to maintain relationships, our ability to be able to have jobs that are fulfilling to us, all of these things which we thought were in our control are suddenly not in our control. And we're suddenly experiencing the world like that person who's bumbling along in Parshat Ki Teitzei. Oh, look, there's a parah. Oh, look, there's a nest, right? Part of dealing with this enormous reality of the pandemic is just kind of accepting the idea that there are things that are beyond our control and letting that wave rush over us. And at the same time, I think there's a danger in kind of leaving our process with regard to the world as it is now at that place of happenstance. dafka in that situation where we feel like we have little control, I think that the Torah is challenging us to say, wait a second, this is the place in which you need to stop, notice, and shift from being a passive observer of what's happening around you to an active party who chooses to act in a particular way. And it's difficult, right? Especially now, I think a lot of times when we use the word dignity, right? A lot of times we use it to talk about how it's important. It was important during lockdown to wake up and take a shower and take care of ourselves, right? Take care of our bodies. That's what helps us maintain Tzelem Elohim, right? Our dignity of what it means to kind of be and feel like a person. And while that's true, what we need to do is not stay in that place where the world, the way it is acting upon us, and the most that we can do is kind of protect ourselves. I think what the mitzvot and this attitude is challenging us to do is look at things that are happening to us and be very careful about breaking it down and making choices. When do I have a choice? Right? When do I have a choice? When I look at, am I going to go outside or am I going to have someone else serve me? Right? What does it mean to be an essential worker? What does it mean to be inside? Right? How do I look at all of the choices that I'm making? And am I looking at those as choices, or am I looking at those as things that are beyond me that happen to me? That's critical. And I think that's the challenge. What we need to be able to do, and what I think that we see here, is how do we maintain our own dignity by ensuring that we're making the right choices that are helping us help others maintain their dignity, right? What it means to be human is to observe the world and also to interact with the world in a moral way and make moral choices. What kinds of moral choices am I making? Those are the moral choices that help me maintain the dignity of other human beings. Those are the moral choices that help me ensure that someone else is safe when they're helping me out. Right? How do I create social systems that make it so that essential workers can work but are also safe? Right? That's me building a house and putting a fence around it. Right? How do I return lost objects? How do I look and see who around me is in dire need of my help? And instead of thinking, well, everyone's in need of help now, I'm just going to try to help myself. What are the places where I can step out of myself and actually make sure that I'm maintaining my own dignity and also maintaining that of other people? So I think that's the lesson of Tzelem Elohim at this point. And that's what happens when we look at Sefer Bereshit and look back at Sefer Dvarim and see that the mitzvot offer us an opportunity to interact with things that feel coincidental, to shift ourselves from being passive observers of the world and make us into agents of morality and agents of choice in order to ensure the Tzelem Elohim of others.